We'll get going here. Mr. Tim, can you turn me down just a little bit there? It's a little loud out here. Feeding back just a little bit. There you go. We're grateful that you boated in, canoe, whatever you might have taken. Our crowd is a little thin tonight. Kind of expected that to be the case because knew that a lot of folks might make the better decision. Certainly some of our older folks especially. Wise decision to stay out or stay in and not get out in the weather. So we'll miss them, but thankful that that hopefully we can all have a good evening here together and study. We are going to continue in our study on the 12 apostles as we get going here. I don't know if I told this story before or not, but I've got this slide. I try to use our logo. By the way, some of you know, I think I mentioned this before, but this is just something we kind of had done by somebody not affiliated with this area at all, but trying to use it, and so I try to use the beginning of my lessons. But most of you have met the Scarboroughs, Jacob Scarborough that had the knee surgery. They were here back with us Sunday night. But his oldest, Merrick, I'm not sure how old Merrick is, but one Wednesday night when they got here, he came in and he saw that, and he thought that meant I was going to preach again. He said, "Oh, no." And he said, "Oh," and then he's like, no, you don't have to go in there and listen to that guy. You get to go in the classroom and listen to somebody else. So, but I like using that to begin with. So, but we are going to pick up and try to get going with our study on 12 ordinary men because I've mentioned that I kind of had this push-pull with this material that, Peter was so much, it took 2 weeks, but certainly we have a limited time. So we want to be done by the end of this quarter and the end of this year and move on to the next topic. And so some weeks, such as this week and a few others, especially like with John and others, there'll be enough to cover that we'll have to kind of get through it because we can't push it to a 2-week study or that kind of thing. And as I've mentioned, by the time we get to the end and some of those that we know very, very little about, we'll kind of combine them together to make a certain amount of time. So tonight we're going to talk about Andrew. And Andrew is considered in this book to be the apostle of small things. Now that is the picture. Some of you were here on the Sunday night that I talked about the new Apologetics Press cards, the Bible trading cards that they had come out with, and Campbell had gotten some when we went to PTP, and so that's the picture that they had for Andrew on the Andrew trading card that they have as those sets of cards. And so when I was trying to think about something to use, of course, when you look up apostles, a lot of times what you'll find is what the Catholic Church or the Orthodox Church or whatever uses and calls them saints, and they've got those halos like we showed a few weeks ago. And so there's a lot of old paintings way of looking at things. And of course, the last 2 weeks I had used AI to kind of generate an idea of Peter, but Andrew, by Mr. MacArthur's topic and taking a look at him, is considered, he calls him, it's not scriptural, but he calls him the apostle of small things. And so we're going to try to think about that tonight. And to begin, I don't have it on the slide, but I would challenge you to think, he mentions, have you ever met two brothers and thought, how could these two people come from the same set of parents, right? Have you ever looked at someone and said, I don't understand how they can be so different, yet they came from the same mother and the same father? And as we think about that, of course, tonight, we're going to think about someone who was impetuous and someone who was outspoken in Peter, and then someone who came from the same people but seems to be very, very different. And, you would think that even though maybe they might have looked similar physically, or sometimes, brothers don't exactly. They don't have the same physical appearance. But even if they do, sometimes their personalities are so different. And so people ask, how could these two come from the same stock? And maybe that question was asked when it came to Peter and when it came to Andrew. A few things to consider to begin. First of all, I'm going to zoom in on this map, so if you want to take a look at it here to try to set the stage for us. We're going to have several maps tonight because I hope that it helps you maybe put things into perspective. And so when we look at this thing works if you're sitting here tonight and you can see, but I got a little green pointer here. But of course, down here is the Dead Sea, and that is the Jordan River and where the children of Israel would have crossed to go to Jericho. We talked about this, several months ago when we talked about the book of Joshua. And then there is Jerusalem. So down here is the neck of the woods that we're usually thinking of crossing the Jordan River, Jerusalem. Up here you see Galilee. We know a lot about Galilee. You think about Nazareth. the wedding at Cana, right? We talk about those. And of course, in between is Samaria. And so when we talk about, Jesus going through Samaria, meeting the Samaritan woman instead of going around Samaria, this is the map. This is what we're talking about. Now, keep in mind here, this top Sea of Galilee. This is the Sea of Galilee, this body of water at the top. Keep that in mind, and let's zoom in on that area. So there's the Sea of Galilee again. And what we know about Andrew and Peter is that they would have been from Bethsaida, the right-hand arrow, but at some point moved over to Capernaum. And they moved over and lived in that area, and that was where they were going to then spend a lot of their time and their business, their fishing business together. In fact, Mark says in Mark chapter 1 and verse 29, Mark records for us, "Now, as soon as they had come out of the synagogue, they entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John." So, Mr. MacArthur surmises that they may have shared a house. I don't know if that's exactly true or not. He's going to heal Peter's mother-in-law there in Mark chapter 1 in that occasion. But this kind of puts us in the region of where they would have been. As you know, of course, Capernaum, we talked about their fishing business last week or 2 weeks ago maybe. We talked about the different kinds of fish that they could have caught, more than likely would have caught in the Sea of Galilee. And so that's where we are when we think about these things. So, small things. The apostle is small things, and then I'm going to throw in there this idea of shadow. We'll get to that in just a moment. When we think about Andrew was always in the first group, but probably the least known of the four. We sing Peter, Andrew, James, and John, but it's true that he was probably the one that folks didn't know as much about. I referenced this a few weeks ago, but you remember, hopefully, that maybe I forgot to look that up, but back towards the end of the summer, I preached a sermon entitled Jesus' Inner Circle, and we talked about the fact that these men made up that inner circle, but Andrew is kind of left out of that because he was not at several key moments. For whatever reason, that might have been. But he was not at the raising of Jairus' daughter. He was not at the Mount of Transfiguration. And then he was not called into the garden there in those final moments before Jesus is going to be taken and then taken to the authorities. And that what happens there in the garden. But he's not present there. So he is always in that first group. I've not brought it up here again in a couple of weeks, but the chart we've had with the different listings, he's always in that first group. But it is true that he is the least known. In fact, his name is mentioned about 13 times. If you take out the list, and the list I see now, that's a little misleading there. His name is mentioned 13 times. There were 4 lists. Remember, if you take out the 4 lists, he's only mentioned 9 times, and most of those only mention him in passing, just his name. He was there. It's not that there are 9 different accounts or 9 occasions in which he is discussed in great detail. 13 times his name is used. Take out those just simple listing of the 12. Was it Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Acts? I think those were right. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Acts. Take those out, and it's just 9 times, and at least 4 or 5 of those, I think, are just, hey, he was there. These are the people who were there. And he's kind of mentioned in passing. So we're getting to try to think about someone who wasn't as well known and was just kind of mentioned in a small kind of way. Now, we're going to come back to this idea of the apostle of small things. That's not necessarily the same thing, but certainly his presence, as far as recorded in Scripture, is kind of in a small way as well. He appears to be the least contentious. Right? Now, I don't know if that's exactly true, but he appears to be the least contentious. He appears to maybe, in connection with that, be the most thoughtful. Now, let me ask you this question. How hard would it be to be the least contentious when you've got impetuous Peter on one side and the sons of thunder on the other side, right? Out of that 4. You've got Peter and James and John, the sons of thunder, and I don't know that it's that hard to be the least contentious. And so, however you want to look at it, and that's not to say, and I think maybe Tammy mentioned it a few weeks ago in here, or somebody, and we were talking about it. We wondered aloud about what Peter's later life was like, if he ever had those kind of go back to his old ways moments in the book of Acts, or even later in life. And so, same thing with Andrew here. I'm not suggesting that he never lost his temper, that he was just simply mild-mannered all the way around, but if the Bible maybe does kind of record for us sometimes enough about someone to get a little bit of a feeling, not always, some people are just mentioned in passing, but mentioned at least that many times, then maybe he was sort of different. He stood out just a little bit in this inner circle than Peter and James and John. Many times, in fact, I think it's maybe 6. I looked at that this morning. I forgot to write it down, but I think maybe 6 out of the 9, or actually 13, including the list. 6 out of the 13 times he is mentioned or designated as Simon Peter's brother. You think that ever got old, right? You think that ever got frustrating to think about, who are you? In fact, I kind of have this joke. I use it quite often, especially around town here. But, if I go out in town to do something, I'm only known as Hannah's husband, right? That's how people know me. So I go to the school, I go anywhere, and I'm trying to think where I was the other day but I went somewhere the other day, and I introduced myself, and I'm like, they don't know who I am. I'm Hannah's husband. Oh, okay, yeah, we know Hannah. So, but being facetious there, but how many times is he designated as Simon Peter's brother? And maybe there's a bit of frustration there, although I think we can say that it appears that there is no resentment. And why is that? Well, in at least one case, because who did he go see first when he met Jesus, or he first saw Jesus? He went and found his brother. He went and found his brother. Let me ask you. You don't have to answer out loud, of course. Let me ask you. Would you go find your brother? Would you go find your sibling if you knew their personality, if you knew their tendencies? Or would you be willing to say, I'll just keep this to myself for a little while longer? Or, I really don't want Peter to stick his foot in his mouth, so I'll tell him later, but I'm going to go follow Jesus first. We're using these words. I wrote them down in my own notes here. I didn't put them on the slide, but as I was reading this chapter again, I keep coming across these words that I've encouraged you to think about. Probably, evidently, likely, it seems this way. We don't know, but maybe it seems as if he doesn't show any resentment because, number one, we don't see it brought out in Scripture, and then number two, for whatever good or bad relationship he might have had, and I'm not suggesting it was bad. In fact, Mr. MacArthur makes a strong point that Peter, Andrew, James, and John may have been friends for a long time, may have been close business associates, may have lived very close to each other, so it doesn't seem like they can't get along. But certainly, we know that when he is, in John chapter 1 there, verses 37 through 42, when he sees Jesus and comes across the Messiah, he goes and he finds his brother and is going to tell him about it. And so despite whatever, and this is kind of back, did he live in the shadow? I think he probably had to live part of his life in the shadow of his better-known brother, but that doesn't mean that it stopped him or that he didn't do good things, or that he wasn't still active in his own ways. But as we said there at the top of the screen, he is often designated as Peter's brother. There's Peter's brother. And so maybe the shadow, and that's why I have that at the top there, maybe that shadow was something he had to deal with. And of course, in the lesson, it's kind of brought out, maybe you feel that way. As we try to make application, maybe you feel like you are a little lost in the shadow of others. Not a sibling, but somebody else that you feel is a better preacher or speaker or teacher or song leader or servant or whatever. And you say, well, I'm not as talented as them in this way. And you feel in the shadow, but it doesn't have to be that way. It took 12. Here it takes about 120, right? Or so, 100 of us, 120 of us to get the work done. It takes all of us in different ways. And so I think we kind of begin to see that with Andrew as we start thinking about some of these guys that we maybe know a little less and a little less about. Any comments or questions there?
Of course, I'll probably get to it, but the significant thing about Andrew is that he did bring his brother to Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
What if he hadn't done that? Would we have had, if he hadn't done what he could do, and that's a small thing, mention it to your brother, but if he hadn't done that, then of course you'd like to think everything would have fell
Sure.
out just about the same, but you don't know.
Yeah. And that kind of hurts our brain to think about those things, right? We talk about that sometimes when we talk about God's will or God caused this to happen, or we talk about providence. It kind of hurts our head to think about because we don't know, and we can't know those kinds of things. I talk about my family and my situation growing up, and when I was getting ready to get out of high school and go to college, I considered Alabama. Just being an Alabama fan and all, I thought, well, it'd be fun. I'll go down there and find a major and see what I want to do. And, through the course of several different things, not anything that I think in particular, but somebody from Freed-Hardeman says, hey, you ought to come here. Don't leave. Come be a part of Freed-Hardeman. Your parents went here and all this. And then I did, okay? Well, then I think about, would I be standing here tonight? And now we're back to what Freddie was saying a minute ago. It kind of hurts our mind to think about, or hurts our brain to try to contemplate all these what ifs. And you'd like to think you might have ended up in the same place, but who's to say and who knows? But certainly, as Freddie says, one of the great things is that he did go and find his brother. So thinking about that, let's talk about a few facts. Back to John chapter 1 for just a few moments there. There is this timeline, and I have encouraged you, and I would challenge you and encourage you again. If you are enjoying this and want to study more on your own, then go do some of this research on your own to figure these things out. Because you would need, all 4 accounts open. You would need maybe a copy of a Bible that has them, a synoptic gospel, or we call them sometimes, that have them together kind of thing. But it can be challenging. I use the word fun, but it could be interesting or fun to try to do that timeline and think about it yourself. But Mr. MacArthur and some others point out that there seems to be this idea that, number one, they were fishermen, right? That's what they did. They were fishermen. Before Jesus, gets into his ministry, they were fishermen. It seems as if, number 2, they go to follow after John. Now, whether it says exactly Peter, Andrew, James, and John, or who exactly, in John chapter 1, notice there it says verse 35, again the next day, John stood with 2 people, 2 of his disciples. Looking at Jesus, as Jesus goes by, he says, behold, the Lamb of God. The 2 disciples heard him, and they followed Jesus. And then Jesus turns to them, speaks to them, and then we see one of the 2 who heard John, verse number 40, speak and followed him was Andrew. All right, so one of them was Andrew. Now, Mr. MacArthur's pretty adamant that the other one is John. And I don't know, we could quibble about that. That's why I would say, hey, go do some research on your own. Were Peter, Andrew, James, and John all there? But here's the timeline. All right, let me get back. Number 1, they were fishermen. Number 2, they go to follow John or be disciples of John to some extent. What happens third is they go back to being fishermen for a little while. Because then number 4 is when Jesus comes and gets them from their boats as they're fishing that's mentioned in the other accounts, and then follow. So it might be a little different than you've commonly thought of before, but you're going to need to do some of that research to think about it. Andrew's often called the first to be called because of what happens here in John chapter 1. When he meets Jesus, and as we said from a few moments ago, verse 41, he first found his own brother Simon and said to him, we have found the Messiah, which is translated the Christ. And then we talked about this a few weeks ago, that maybe the first words uttered to Peter were here in verse number 42, at least as it's recorded for us, as Jesus talks about being called Cephas, which is translated a stone. And so verse 39, come and see. Come and see. I was looking up pictures and trying to get together my PowerPoint, and there was at least one of these old kind of style paintings, depictions of what Andrew might have looked like, that had off to the side, first to be called. I mean, that's what it said. So that's commonly what he, just a kind of a fact of the case there that's usually mentioned. Was he faithful first? Now, John 1, 35 through 40, it seems to be he was already a disciple of John. Now, it's not the same thing. John says, I'm not the Messiah, but he seems to be faithful first before anything, and faithful to John and being a disciple of John and what John was preaching and what John was doing there. And so maybe he was faithful even before meeting Jesus to someone or something, to what God had in mind for that period of time before he even met him. Also, like we said just a moment ago, the first to be called, he was a leader, but he was different than his brother. Now, reminder once again that this book is sort of centered a little bit on leadership, and so we're going to keep pulling out at these strands of the fact that we can all be leaders in different ways and in different forms, and certainly all 12 had maybe some level of leadership, and so he was a leader, but there's no doubt he was not Peter, and he probably wasn't trying to be Peter. I have a question for you when we think about Andrew. How many times is Andrew mentioned in the book of Acts? Not a trick question. 1 or 0, depending on how you want to look at it. 1, and that his name is mentioned there, but 0, and that nothing else is said about him after that. Now, we're going to try to think about his life a little more for the rest of our time, and then at the very end come back and think about the end of his life as we did with Peter, and we kind of want to as much as we can with all 12 of these fellas here. But, there's no long story of what he did, how he might have helped spread the gospel or what took place. So the rest of the chapter then, and we're going to look at the accounts, but again, the book focuses on Andrew the leader, and there's 3 things we want to mention. 3 things. First of all, turn to John chapter 6. John chapter 6. Number 1, the book suggests that he saw the value of individual people. He saw the value of individual people. Maybe Andrew didn't address the crowds. What do we see? How many more times do we read Peter's name in the book of Acts? A bunch. What happens after Acts chapter 2? He's there in Acts 3, in Acts 4. Peter and John are going about, and they're getting put in prison. They're having these trials because they're speaking in front of the crowds. They're speaking in front of the councils. Maybe Andrew didn't do that and address the crowds or councils like his brother did, but Andrew was acquainted with Jesus, and he personally introduced individuals to meet the King, King Jesus. Think about the fact that maybe he was the first missionary. We might even call him that. And the material references a lesson that I've done here before. I think I did it here last year, maybe. But the youngest missionary, remember the youngest missionary? She's found in 2 Kings chapter 5. The young servant girl that introduces Naaman, right? And encourages Naaman of what to do. So I've sometimes called her, and you may have heard that lesson, the youngest missionary. Well, maybe Andrew is a missionary in the sense that he is bringing individuals. We already mentioned John chapter 1. It was Andrew who introduced Peter to Jesus. And what this didn't take? It didn't take a 30-minute sermon. It didn't take a 45-minute Bible class. It took the ability to go to someone on a personal level and say, come and meet this fella. Now, I know that come and see in John chapter 1, there's what Jesus says to Andrew, but I know there are places, several places I've seen on Facebook or social media where they will have what they call come and see Sundays to try to encourage the congregation to invite friends to come and see what the church is doing and what the work of the church is and to come be a part of worship. So Jesus gave that encouragement to Andrew, but Andrew is kind of doing the same thing. Not standing on the stump making the longest sermon you've ever heard, but just simply personally saying, hey, come and see. And an individual person here. So John chapter 6, once again, Andrew helped the situation by bringing a boy to Jesus, right? Bringing a boy to Jesus. Yeah, that picture, that's what, and I think I mentioned this the night I talked about the cards, but to some level, the folks at Apologetics Press, and in particular Jeremy Pate is the fellow's name, but just took a lot of this and put it into AI and allowed it to spit out these pictures. And so now we're back to the fact that what do you know about Andrew? Not a lot, but you know that he was involved in this situation here, and you see the little boy there. Now, here's another challenge for you, all right, little homework for you to kind of find interesting to do. Go read the different accounts of this situation and then see what happens. Because the book brings out that others in this moment, were at a loss of what to do, right? You go read through and some of them are like, we got a problem here. What are we going to do? I feel like that's, the way some of us react sometimes. We're not getting to solutions. We're just kind of running around going, well, there's a big problem. Yeah, fretting and fussing about it. And somebody says, hey, we got to do something. Now, let's quit worrying and lamenting over the fact that there's a problem. And often those are the ones who are overthinking the problem, right? They're kind of making such a big deal about it. But Andrew knew the value of small steps, it seems. He knew the value that even a little boy could bring there. Do we get the indication that Andrew knew for a fact? So we talked about this with Peter. What did Peter know for a fact when he does certain things? Did he or did he not know? We kind of mentioned that. Did Andrew know for a fact that all Jesus needed was just that little bit of food? Maybe, maybe not. He had seen him do some things already, but whether he did or he didn't, he certainly sees a solution, even if it doesn't seem to be enough. He sees a little boy, and he's going to bring him to Jesus. Now, real quick, go to John chapter 12, because here's the lesser known one. John chapter 12, verses 20 through 26. This is where we start getting into the part of the gospel accounts that we sometimes blow right by. We blow right through them. What happens before that? In your Bible, if you're looking there in John chapter 12, verse 12, the triumphal entry. You know, people know about the triumphal entry, right? They know about this coming into town and the palm trees in verse 13, the branches and the donkey in verse 14. But go to verse 20. Now there were certain Greeks among those who came up to worship at the feast. Then they came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida of Galilee, we noticed that a moment ago, and asked him, saying, Sir, we wish to see Jesus. What's Philip going to do? He goes and finds Andrew. Philip came and told Andrew, and in turn, Andrew and Philip told Jesus. He brought the Greeks to hear the truth from Jesus. I don't know why Philip went to Andrew. I don't know why he didn't go straight to Jesus, but I know who knew the right thing to do and did it. It was Andrew, right? And we don't know exactly how many this was, if it was 2, if it was 10, if it was 30, but whatever it was, he saw the value here and knew the way, who to point people towards. Hey, let's go see Jesus. You know, I know exactly where to go. And so real quick here, I'm going to run out of time. Maybe you're timid. Maybe you're afraid to speak up in a crowd. Maybe you don't want to be the center of attention. Maybe you're more Andrew than you are Peter. But that can be an asset. And I'm telling you, as much as I love standing right here every week and preaching the gospel and teaching and all that, that's not what's going to convert people a lot of times. They don't want to come in here and hear me speak for 30 minutes, and that's going to do it all the time. Most of the time, it's that relationship evangelism. It's that individual, that personal care. Andrew saw the value of individual people, at least so it seems, from a few different accounts here. When he goes and finds somebody or they come to him, he knows exactly where to go. Number 2, sorry to kind of rush through too quick here. He saw the value of insignificant gifts. Back to John chapter 6 for just a few moments, right? An issue arises. No solution is obvious to the apostles. In fact, in John chapter 6 and verse 7, Philip sees. What does Philip see? This is what I told you to do. I'm going to do some of it for you here, right? But John chapter 6 and verse 7, what does Philip see? Well, Philip sees that they don't have enough money, creating more problems, or at least making it deeper. Sorry, we got all these people who are hungry. We don't have enough money. Sometimes people can see the big picture better, or certain people can see the big picture better if they have the ability to appreciate the small things and how much that can influence the whole. And maybe that's a quality that Andrew had. Matthew 14, you don't have to turn there, but Matthew 14, 15, all the apostles seem to be at a loss. I'm doing your homework for you. Man, we're going to run out of time here. But Andrew knew what the boy had. He knew it was small, but he knew that it was going to be, that maybe that Jesus could do. And he still brings him to Jesus for consideration. And as the book says, the material says, the rest is history. The rest is history. And what a difference an seemingly insignificant gift made. Sometimes we think too big, Sometimes we wait for a grand gesture to make a difference. Is that not the problem? Sometimes, I've heard people talk about, I read this one time a few years ago, as people talk about, New Year's resolutions and dieting and that kind of thing, and somebody was talking about dieting and exercise. And so you know what the problem is? Everybody waits till, New Year's, and then they tell everybody what they're going to do, and then they feel bad when they don't live up to it, because we all struggle with that. Instead of just deciding, you know what, it's October 29th, I'm just going to start today, and I'm just going to get started. I'm just going to get going, because we like big gestures. What, Brady? I'm not even going to tell anybody about it. I mean, I forget wish I could remember what that was, but it was a very interesting thought about how we handle those things sometimes. When we like to make grand gestures, we say, well, I'm turning 50 this year. I'm gonna do it all on that day. You know what usually happens on New Year's Day? We're all really tired because we were up too late the night before, right? And then we're all going to eat a big meal that's full of cornbread and greasy stuff and hog jowl and all that. And so there's the diet out the window right on the first day. So we're big on grand gestures, but how much does just a small thing? And maybe you've heard it said before that Andrew took a little boy's lunch, and thousands were fed, that kind of thing. And so small contributions, small gifts. We talked about this with our stewardship back earlier this year. We're going to save up until we can give $10,000 to the church. Well, none of us ever get close to $10,000 to give at one time. Let's just give the dollar. Let's just give the small things. And let's just show up and do the small things, the insignificant, seemingly insignificant things.
Actually, essential.
Essential. That's a good way to say it. Essential. So number 3 then, very quickly here, he saw the value of inconspicuous service. I've had to say that 45 times today to make sure I don't jumble it too bad. He says in the book here, some people won't play ball unless they get to pitch. All right? I'm not going to play unless I get to be the quarterback. That was the nature from time to time of maybe James and John and even Peter. Now, we'll get to James and John. We'll be off next week, of course, for the gospel meeting. Troy will be just have our regular service on Wednesday night. But as we come back around to, let me look here real quick. James is the next, and then John. But James and John, that's it. We want to be top dog. We want top billing. And if we can't have it, it seems like maybe we're going to take a step back. But not Andrew. He wasn't headlining. He wasn't getting credit by the crowds. He just quietly and strongly, it seems, was doing what he was doing, leading people to Jesus. Look at Mark chapter 9 real quick. Now, this is another perhaps. That's the other word. I'm going to get these down before we're done with this. But perhaps, likely, seems. Mark chapter 9, verses 35 through 37, in Mark's account there. He sat down, called the 12, and said to them, then he took a little child and set him in the midst of them. Who brought that child? Who grabbed that child? Well, it says Jesus there, right? He took the little child. The book points out, was Andrew the one that was nearby, maybe helping children or bringing the children around, maybe taking the time to do that? It does say that as Jesus makes the point there in verse 35 and then verse 36, he, the way we have it there, probably nearby with a capital H, took the little child. And so I'm not telling you that's exactly what's going on here, but just kind of thinking about some of these things. Maybe Andrew's involved on the outside that we don't know for sure. And here's the thing. He was likely to do that, even if he didn't do it right there, maybe. He seems to be likely to be the one that would grab somebody and bring them to the front or introduce them to Jesus. And man, I don't know about you, but it hurts my brain, kind of another thinking thing here, to imagine all that happens around Jesus in a 8-hour period during a day, right? Or more than 8 most of the time. 12-hour day, how long did he work? When he says he was tired, remember we talked about the Peter and them getting in the boat? Was he tired? He was tired. How many people came up to him? How many people are dragging somebody up to them or carrying somebody up to him? And so it was a lot, I'm sure. But maybe Andrew is one of those that was, involved with that just a little bit. So for those who relate little to Peter, maybe your quiet strength and concern for one person at a time can find guidance and inspiration in the efforts of Andrew, a faithful apostle of our Lord Jesus, and what he was doing here. He seems to see the value of individual people, of insignificant gifts, and inconspicuous service. He doesn't have to be the one up front, but it's certainly somebody it takes to get the work done. I do have several concluding things here, but what comments or questions there? Anybody? Yeah. It's this is a very interesting study. I don't know, because we know their names, we sing them all together, we know the 12. And I mentioned this with Peter, but I'd like for you to get in your mind as much as you can, the difference in the gospel accounts, which for Andrew and many, that's all we know, right? Andrew's not one that's going to get airtime in Acts, but there are some that we'll find more about. But for Peter, we said that, here's these acts, same word there, of Peter's life. Early Peter, when he's serving Jesus in the ministry, then the book of Acts, then the future, as he's writing these epistles later. And so think about just that timeline of their life and what they learned and how they might have changed and how they might have grown. And for Andrew in particular, man, knowing so little, it'd be one of those questions you want to add to your list, right? You'd love to ask, you'd love to be able to know. What all did he get into as he continued to share the good news? And we'll get more to that in just a second. Go ahead, Freddie.
You had that picture of that area up there on Sea of Galilee, and remember, I think it's Acts 11, somewhere in there, where Jesus said it will be more tolerable for Sodom and Gomorrah and Tyre and Sidon than those cities right up there where all this stuff's going on, because they saw all these miracles, and they did not oppose Jesus up there. They just didn't pay any attention to him. And he said, man, y'all had more opportunity to know that what you had in your midst was from God. And if Tyre and Sidon had that much information, they would have turned backflips and not ended up where they're going to be in eternity. But yet here with these people who just said, well, it didn't matter to them. And so he condemns them.
Yeah. Before we talk about the end of Andrew's life, let me ask you real quick, turn to Matthew 4, verse 8, picking up in verse 18. Matthew 4, picking up in verse 18. As we think about beginning to turn the page and bridging this gap between Peter and Andrew and James and John, I enjoyed reading this again. We've heard it, I don't know how many times, but verse 18, Jesus walking by the Sea of Galilee saw two brothers, Simon called Peter and Andrew his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. Then he said to them, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. They immediately left their nets and followed him. Going on from there, he saw two other brothers, James the son of Zebedee and John his brother, in the boat with Zebedee their father, mending their nets. He called them, and immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him. Now, all the account, we've already looked at John 1, Matthew 4. They're all, of course, towards the beginning, if you want to go look at some of those. But all four were fishermen. All four seemed to be very close to Jesus in some way. All four left their job together. And, all four were with Jesus on various occasions. But it just struck me, and even reading that, just even again today, kind of finishing up my thoughts and getting my notes together, that's a powerful moment there to think about, just dropping it, and even James and John leaving their nets and their father and following after Jesus. And this is kind of back to the big grand gesture. It seemed like a big grand gesture, like maybe the sun was shining and, you heard a sound kind of thing, but just Jesus passing by and calling them, and then them just dropping what they have, which is what, of course, it requires of us to some extent, leaving behind some things, but also, getting rid of some things and just leaving certain things to get on with following Jesus. Miss Diane?
Yeah, I got to think about that because Andrew was one of two people that was right next to John when John said, behold, here's the Lamb of God. But he was very, very close to John. And then he got very, very close to Jesus. But also, he was one of the four, so I'm sure they talked.
Yeah.
About that when he was with John. So when Jesus came and said, follow me, I think, I would say, okay.
Yeah.
Well, it's like John did a good job of what he was supposed to be doing. I mean, he got them ready for then when they saw Jesus, it wasn't a shock, because if John didn't do his job, and we know he did, then they knew what they was looking for.
So was this incident where they were listening to John and they see Jesus and they follow him before?
And then again.
That's why I think my understanding and was that's kind of in the middle. I mean, they have their lives obviously before anything. Then they become followers of John, and then it seems as if they go back for a little while to fishing, and then Jesus comes by. And so what that timeline was it, months? Was it just a few days? But back to Miss Diane's point, real quick, I just want to mention this. In John 1, John, when Jesus says, come and see, they came and saw where he was staying and remained with him that day. So he didn't just drop Jesus there and say, hold on, let me go get my brother. But still quickly, kind of within a short time, goes and finds his brother. Back to your point, Miss Diane, about there was more there. There's a relationship. He's talking to John. John was preparing the way. He had denied, quite expressly, I'm not the one. I'm not the one. And so I think in the book, I was trying to find it real quick as you were speaking, Miss Diane, but it kind of seems as if, this would have been a big moment, when he points out, there he is. And so I think you're right in kind of thinking about, and it would have been something to consider. Certainly. And then they spend some time with him, wherever that might have been exactly, in some private time, and they leave convinced. They found the true Messiah. So, real quickly here, we got about 5 minutes left. I know my crowd, so little Paul Harvey reference for all you folks, all you old folks, right? Now you know the rest of the story. You don't yet. We're going to get there. So I was thinking about that phrase, though, and if I said that in front of these high school kids, today, they would have no clue what I'm talking about. And, but you all know the rest of the story with Paul Harvey here. So let's do some maps here again. So this is Google Earth today, all right? This is the Earth today. Up here is Russia. You can see it up in the corner, but this is Russia here. Down here in the corner, you can see Israel. This is, what we think of today, and Egypt, where the Exodus would have happened. And, of course, over here is getting to Spain and the United Kingdom and Italy. So keep your eye on these two bodies of water, because we're going to zoom in again. But just to help you see, here's Georgia. Not the Bulldogs, but Georgia. Look at these two bodies of water on either side of Georgia right there. There they are again. All right? And so what I highlighted for you here was Israel, the Jordan. This is the neck of the woods. This is where we just looked at with the Sea of Galilee and the Jordan River. Tradition says that Andrew took the gospel north. All right? That he took the gospel north into this area that was known as, I guess, Scythia or something along those lines. Eusebius, that we mentioned, I think, last week when we came to Peter, Eusebius, the ancient church historian, says that Andrew went as far as what would now be Russia. I can go backwards here, but up into that area there of Russia, kind of going past these bodies of water up to Russia, and there they are. He went north from this area up to even as far as Scythia, so that is why that Andrew is called the patron saint of Russia, is what he is known as. Now, keep in mind that cross there, because we're going to come back to it in just a moment. He's also the patron saint of Scotland, if you know that, but he is considered the patron saint of Russia, and that's why I kind of took the larger look out there. This is tradition. This is Eusebius writing, the church historian, and telling us these things, but that is why he is considered that. And I think I tried to find one you might can make out here, but it seems to be Russian lettering there across the top of that particular picture. So, tradition says that he went to north to preach the gospel. Let's talk about the end. Again, tradition, but tradition says that he was ultimately crucified in Achaia, which is in southern Greece or near Athens. And I think I had one more map here. Yeah. So this is Paul's second missionary journey, but I use that because there's places right? Here's Jerusalem. Here's our neck of the woods, the children of Israel, Jerusalem, the Sea of Galilee, right up here in the name Israel. But here's what right? Galatia, Ephesus, Troas, Philippi, Thessalonica, these are all the names, the congregations And then down here in the southern part of Greece, Greece is Corinth and Athens and Acacia, or Acacia, however you want to say it there. This is ultimately where he was crucified. Now, one account says that he led the wife of a provincial Roman governor to Christ, and that infuriated her husband. And that he demanded, the husband, the Roman governor demanded, that his wife recant her devotion to Christ, and she refused. And so the governor had Andrew crucified. By the governor's orders, those who crucified him lashed him to his cross instead of nailing him in order to prolong his sufferings. And tradition also says that he was crucified on what's called a saltire or a X-shaped cross, like was in that picture just a moment ago. And by most accounts, he hung on the cross for 2 days, exhorting passers-by to turn to Christ for salvation. And so as we've looked at this particular graphic I've used here, we said Peter was crucified upside down at his own request, as what history tells us. And then history tells us that Andrew was crucified on an X-shaped cross. And that saltire, that name that was up there a moment ago, that's a symbol, right? It's on the flag of Scotland. It's in a lot of other places that is used on flags and things, but that is what that's called, and that is how Andrew was supposedly crucified. And it happened because, quite literally, of sharing the gospel with the wrong person in the dying case, right? But the right person in the case that she was a soul that needed to hear the gospel. And so when we think about Andrew, I don't know, as we've kind of already lamented, in the top 4, but somebody that we don't know a whole lot about. And so maybe the apostle of small things is a pretty good way of thinking about him. And the value that he saw in small things and seemed to bring to the table, certainly in the gospel accounts, but probably for his whole life, as he might have traveled north, as he might have been crucified in that way, at least as history records for us. A good challenging thought for us, especially when we want to think that we're not Peter, so we're not any good. And we kind of romanticize the great names, Paul, Peter, that did big things. It took everybody, and it does so with us as well. So We will have next week off again, and then we will pick up with James, and then John the week after, God be willing. Thank you for your comments and good attention.